Hi everyone, it's David here, your favourite Australian living in England. In this video I'm going to demonstrate how to change the oil and clean the oil filters on my Kymco CK125. Now these pictures show the bike I'm working on. It is a 2004 model. The engine and gearbox are very similar to the Honda CG125, and so the procedures shown should be the same. This can be a messy job. So I recommend that before starting you apply a barrier cream to your hands that protects against oil and grease. Now the one I use is called PR88, but there are others. A barrier cream stops oil and grease from soaking into your hands and makes cleaning them afterwards much easier. Now make sure that you work the barrier cream into your skin, and particularly around your fingernails and on your wrists. Rub the cream thoroughly until it soaks into your hands. This is also very useful for protecting sensitive skin from oil and grease. I also suggest that you have some heavy-duty gloves available, particularly for handling parts of the bike that may be hot, like the exhaust system or sump plug, or simply to protect your hands from cuts and scrapes. Right, now first turn the engine on and heat the oil up. The sump plug is located in the middle underneath the crankcase. It has a 17mm hexagonal head. Loosen it with a suitable socket and ratchet handle, as I am doing here, or use a 17mm ring spanner. Position your oil catch tray under the engine. Then, after loosening the sump plug, unscrew it carefully with your hand. Make sure that you catch both the sump plug and its aluminium washer. If they fall into the oil, you'll have to fish them out when the oil stops draining. Now we're going to remove the oil filter cap. Now this requires a 24mm socket or ring spanner. Now as you can see, it's on the side of the engine underneath the crankcase here. I find this a bit of an awkward thing to get at. As you can see, I'm having a bit of a struggle here. What you want to do is loosen the cap and then unscrew it by hand. It's especially awkward when I'm also trying to hold a camera. There we go. Now unscrew it carefully and make sure it is spring-loaded, so beware that it will pop out when fully unscrewed. Catch both the screw cap and the coil spring. Now you want to carefully retrieve the metal gauze oil filter from inside and put the screw cap, the coil spring and the gauze filter safely aside. Now we're going to clean the items removed from the sump. The metal gauze filter shown here needs to be particularly clean. You can use something like paraffin, kerosene or petrol, or a proprietary product like gunk, but I prefer to use methylated spirits as it is easy to buy, less odorous, evaporates quickly leaving no residue, and is less likely to explode. It's also easier to dispose of. You want to pour some into a jar or tin and give the filter a good swirl around and make sure that all the muck has been removed from it. As you can see here, it was a bit of a windy day and I had some trouble with the wind blowing things around, and I had to get a pair of pliers to remove the gauze from the jar. but treat it very carefully, make sure it isn't damaged, and make sure it is very thoroughly clean. Now, separately, give the other items a quick clean as well. They don't need to be as spotlessly clean as the gauze, but just give them a swish around in the methylated spirits. What you can do is, once you've pulled them out and washed them off, dry the items with a piece of kitchen roll or a clean cotton rag. Now, once oil has stopped draining from the sump, make sure that the sump plug is clean of any grit or muck. Put the sump plug back together with its washer, and then screw the sump plug back into the sump. Just tighten it loosely with your fingers, and then finish tightening it with a 17mm socket or a 17mm ring spanner. It doesn't need to be super tight, just reasonably tight. Note that the steel sump plug is being screwed into an aluminium casting, so don't over tighten it and strip the thread. Reassemble the gauze filter with its coil spring like this, and put the coil spring and the filter into the cap like this. Make sure that all of these items are spotlessly clean with no grit, muck or sand or anything like that on them. We'll now screw this unit back into the side of the engine where it came from. You can see the hole there underneath. Make sure that the gauze filter slides back into the recess it originally came from, where it is held by the coil spring, and screw the cap back into its screw thread in the side of the casting. Just tighten it up by hand first of all. It's very easy to do this. Now tighten it finally with a 24mm socket or 24mm ring spanner. It does not need to be very tight. It's an aluminium cap going into aluminium alloy, and if you tighten it too much, it will strip the threads. Collect the waste oil into an old oil container of some kind, and then dispose of it through local oil disposal facilities or recycling centres. Now we're going to remove the exhaust, starting with a 10mm ring spanner. Remove the two nuts at the top end of the exhaust where it attaches to the exhaust port on the head. These two nuts hold a collar, and that collar holds a couple of collets that connect the exhaust pipe to the exhaust port of the head. Pull the collar away. It'll still be quite tight. Now we're going to remove the two nuts at the main mounting point on the silencer further back on the bike. These are 12mm nuts, so need a slightly larger spanner. undo both these nuts completely and loosen the silencer from the bracket that it's held onto. Pull it away, make sure you collect both of the spring washers that are there to make sure that the nuts don't come loose by themselves. At the other end of the pipe, make sure you collect the two metal collets that have been held in place by the collar that you removed when you undid those two 10mm nuts. There you go. Now I'm showing you the collar and the two collets. We're now going to remove the kickstart lever. The bolt at the bottom of the kickstart lever has a 12mm head, so it just uses the same spanner as you use to remove the nuts from the rear of the exhaust pipe. Now, once you've loosened this bolt, remove it completely from the casting at the bottom of the kickstart lever, and remove the whole kickstart lever from the splined shaft. Now undo and remove the tachometer drive from the forward end of the casting. Now this screw is probably going to be very tight, so it may need some persuasion, such as penetrating oil, and in fact for this demonstration I couldn't remove it at all. Undo the two lock nuts on the clutch cable with two 12mm open-ended spanners. Screw the nuts back to slacken off the cable, and then remove the end of the cable from the swivel on the clutch actuating arm. We're now going to remove the 11 clutch cover bolts. These are 8mm heads, so use a long socket of some kind to remove them. Note that 10 of them are shorter, all the same length, and there is one longer one that is right at the front. We now need to remove the foot pegs. The two foot pegs, left and right hand side, are at either end of a long steel shaft that is bolted underneath the crankcase. The same shaft also holds the side stand. There are 4 bolts. On my particular bike, these are 13mm. They need to be undone obviously with a 13mm ring spanner or socket of some kind. Once you've undone all 4 of the bolts, then slide the foot peg off from underneath, out from underneath the bike, like so. Now, using a rubber mallet, tap the casting gently to loosen it, then remove it and put it to one side. Make sure that you keep it scrupulously clean on the inside. Now, spray a little penetrating oil, such as GT85 or WD-40, on the 3 screws holding the cover of the centrifugal oil filter. This device is a sludge trap attached to the end of the crankshaft that uses centrifugal force as the engine turns to remove any solids from the oil as it is pumped through the crankshaft, such as carbon or metal filings. Remove the 3 screws with a Phillips head screwdriver. Make sure that you don't get any muck on the screws. Put them aside on a piece of kitchen roll or a clean cloth somewhere where there will not get any muck on them. Pull the cover off and you'll see that there's a certain amount of black sludge captured inside there. Now, clean the inside of the cover that you removed and the body left on the crankshaft of any sludge that has collected. For this, I'm using a sheet of kitchen roll soaked with methylated spirits. Make sure it's nice and clean, got rid of all the sludge, and make sure that you don't accidentally introduce any muck, sand, grit or anything else. It needs to be very, very clean. Once you've cleaned the body of the centrifugal oil sludge trap and the cover, put the cover back on, reusing the same 3 screws that you removed, making sure that you've kept everything scrupulously clean and not introduced any sand, grit or muck. Remember, all these items are internal parts of the engine and they must not have any muck or grit left on them before you put the cover back on. Do the screws back up with the Phillips head screwdriver. Now, as you're tightening them, be aware that these are steel screws going into an alloy thread. If you tighten them too tight, it will easily strip the thread. These 3 screws do not need to be exceptionally tight. Firm, but not exceptionally tight. Now that that's done, we're going to put the cover back on the side of the engine. You see this little shaft here, that is part of the actuating mechanism of the clutch. Make sure that that is not accidentally lost. Place the cover back over the engine and tap it back in place, making sure you line it up correctly. There are a couple of dowels that must go into their right locations. Tap it back in place with your rubber mallet. Now the cover, as I mentioned before, is held on by 11 bolts. One of the bolts, this one, is longer than the others, and it goes on in this particular spot at the front of the bike. There are 10 others that are shorter that go in all the other holes. Bolt them back up with your 8mm socket. Now you may want to use a new gasket, but if the old gasket is okay, I wouldn't bother. Remember, when you're tightening these bolts, that this is a piece of aluminium casting. It's very rigid. Tighten the bolts on opposite sides evenly around the periphery. Do not just go round in a circle, because if tightened unevenly, this bit of aluminium may crack. We're now going to reattach the foot pegs themselves. Now, as I mentioned before, these are on a steel shaft that goes underneath the engine, and that shaft also holds the side stand. This just goes back underneath the engine in exactly the same way that it came out. It'll be a bit mucky underneath there. because it gets all road muck and oil and whatever. It's held on by 4 bolts. We're now going to reattach the clutch cable. Firstly, that little tang or bobbin on the end goes into the slot on the swivel on the end of the clutch actuating lever. Pull the cable forward to get it in its right position. There are 2 nuts to adjust the clutch cable. We haven't disturbed the clutch cable at the handle end, so we only need to adjust these. Screw the first nut back up until it's in approximately the right position. Use a 12mm open-ended spanner to adjust it as it gets too tight to do it with your fingers. Check it by operating the clutch lever with your hand, and now it's not quite right. I've tightened it a bit too much, so just slacken it a bit now. You want about 10 or 12mm slack at the end of the lever at the handle. Undo it a little bit more. Right, there now seems to be the right amount of slack in the clutch cable at the handlebar end. We're now going to do up the other nut, and using 2 12mm open-ended spanners, we will screw these 2 nuts together so that they are locked together and cannot undo. This makes sure that the clutch cable stays in adjustment. We're now going to reattach the kickstart lever. This goes onto the spline shaft at the back of the gearbox here. There's a number of different positions it can go on to, but you want to get it so that the lever is approximately vertical. Pull it back, just make sure it operates correctly. Once it's on the spline shaft in approximately the right position, put the lock bolt back into the casting at the bottom of the kickstart lever. It will only go in one place. There is a slot in the spline shaft to allow the bolt to slide down. Once it's roughly in position, use a 12mm ring spanner to tighten this bolt back up. This is quite straightforward. This is a steel bolt going into a steel casting, but even so, although it's unlikely to strip unless you abuse it, it doesn't need to be incredibly tight. Just check the operation of the lever once you've tightened the bolt fully. I'm now going to show you how to reattach the exhaust. Make sure that you put this collar over the exhaust first of all. As you can see, the recessed end of the collar needs to go towards the flanged end, which goes onto the exhaust port of the head. Push the flanged end of the pipe into the exhaust port on the head of the engine, and then put the two rear bolts through the rear bracket. We're now going to put the two spring washers onto the captive bolts at the rear, followed by the two 12mm nuts, just screwed loosely by hand, allowing some movement in the exhaust pipe. We'll tighten them later on. We're now going to put the collets onto the end of the exhaust next to the head. The flared end goes outer, and the narrow end goes into the exhaust port next to the head. These two collets go on either side of the exhaust pipe. Bring the collar back up and push it over the two screw studs, and pushing against the collets so that they're held into the head. Now screw the two 10mm nuts back onto the threaded studs either side of the head that are sticking through the collar. Get them on by hand at first, and then use a 10mm ring spanner to tighten the nuts. Now these are steel nuts going onto steel threaded studs, so you can do them up fairly tight. You might want to use a little bit of copper slip or something to lubricate the threads, which also helps stop them from seizing. Be careful tightening these nuts. As I said, they can be tightened fairly tight, but if you strip the threads on the studs, then you will have to get a professional to replace the studs in the head, and that will be a right pain in the arse. Now once you've tightened those, you can tighten the two 12mm nuts at the rear bracket on the exhaust. Just use your 12mm ring spanner. Right, do you think we're now ready to start and drive away? No, there's no oil in the engine. So remove the filler cap, which also has a dipstick on it. We're now going to put 1 litre of 10W40 multigrade engine oil into the engine. Now you want to use a scrupulously clean funnel to do this, and I'm using a small glass jar to pour oil down into the funnel and into the engine. Make sure that if you do it this way, if you're not pouring directly from the bottle, that the funnel and the glass jar, whatever you're using, are scrupulously clean. I've cleverly put my hand in the way so you can't see very well. Now once you've got the litre of oil in there, stick the dipstick back in without screwing it in and pull it out again. Make sure that there is oil at least halfway up the cross-hatched bit on the bottom end of the dipstick. Then screw the dipstick, if it is correct, screw the dipstick back fully into the engine. And I can now start it again and we'll see how we go.